Welcome to Recipes for Grief, heartfelt storytelling for feely foodies. I'm your host, Andrea Sexton Dumas.
Hello and welcome to episode 12. Before we get started with this episode, which is the Harriet Tubman episode, I just wanted to speak on a few things. First and foremost, I refer multiple times to receiving direction in mystical ways, perhaps receiving voice messages or dreams that might give you instructions. And I also want to be very clear that if you are hearing voices, especially voices that might be instructing you to harm yourself or others, please contact a mental health professional. If you are in crisis, you can dial 988. This number is valid throughout the United States. This is a mental health crisis hotline. If you are not in crisis, but you are concerned, please do your due diligence and research to find yourself a mental health professional in your area who can support you through what you are going through. A few other things I wanted to speak on include the title to a book that I repeatedly say incorrectly. The book is Rest is Resistance, a Manifesto by Tricia Hersey. Another thing I also just wanted to touch on briefly is my language around extrasensory skills and gifts. So a lot about what I'm speaking on here in this episode is referring to the clairs, clairsentience, clairaudience, astral projection, things that might be considered psychic gifts or skills. But then I also refer to divination through stones and through tarot decks. And so I am conflating the two and joining them together because both are part of my life. There are many ways to connect with the divine. There are many ways to be woo-woo. And so I'm not really going into the definitions of things here. I'm speaking more generally and broadly about why these things are important beyond our own personal and mundane interests. One thing specifically that I mentioned that I do feel the need to clarify is stigmata. So I've referenced stigmata. In the Christian tradition, this refers to marks corresponding to those left on Jesus's body by the crucifixion. So the nails in his hands and feet, the slash on his chest, as well as marking from the crown of thorns. These are the wounds that Jesus experienced when he was being crucified on the cross. And in the Christian tradition, there are some people, for example, St. Francis of Assisi, as well as Padre Pio, are two well-known saints. And I also make reference to a young person in Oakland who also experienced stigmata, Coco Robinson. And the last thing I want to speak on regarding this podcast, as I speak about Harriet Tubman and escaping to freedom through the Underground Railroad, it's not lost on me that as I'm recording this podcast and publishing it, it is November 21st of 2023 as I'm recording this snippet, and there are very serious conflicts happening around the world as I'm speaking. So very specifically right now, I'm referring to Palestine, specifically Gaza, the Gaza Strip, as well as the Congo and Sudan. I don't mention any of these conflicts in this episode, but as we are witnessing in real time, innocent people being collectively punished and the resources from the earth beneath them being stolen as they are being displaced from their homelands, I think it's really important to keep that in mind, the context of what I'm saying today and what Harriet Tubman was going through, as well as what these innocent folks are experiencing throughout the world. While I don't have a food correspondence for this particular episode, I think that you can use the idea of intuition as a recipe for grief, and grief speaking to the collective grief and the collective experiences of capitalism, imperialism, land theft, and genocide. And the very last thing, I just wanted to read a couple sentences from the article that I reference in Edge Science. The article is Harriet Tubman Precog, and it reads, "The fact that Tubman's story has reminded so many people of Joan of Arc is no counter-argument to it. If anything, it should prompt us to make the cut and consider the both-and possibility that prophetic dreams and the charm that comes from a divine mandate could be a real pattern in the lives of charismatic freedom fighters whenever and wherever they appear. Super and natural."
Welcome to the Harriet Tubman episode. I would like to thank Harriet Tubman herself for all that she did while incarnate on this earth and all that she's teaching us today. To give you the cliff notes of what I'm going to say today, Harriet Tubman is back. This means a few different things that I hope I can articulate well for you here today. I'm going to do the best I can. I have notes that I have not had time to organize. I have more research that I want to do. And yet, this message, this spirit is pressing upon me so much. I cannot wait until I have time. I cannot wait until my notes are perfect. I cannot wait until I have an encyclopedia of information to share with you all. I just need to share this. So with that, I ask, may what needs to be said, and may what needs to be heard, be heard. I offer gratitude to all of my ancestors, past, present, and future, for bringing me here to this moment today. And I extend my gratitude to yours as well, that they have brought you here today to hear this message. I pulled a card before I started recording. The deck I'm using today is the HooDoo Tarot from Tayannah McQuillar. And the card that I pulled is the Big House, 16. That correlates with the Tower card in a traditional tarot deck. I'm going to describe what is on this card, and then I'm going to read a little bit from McQuillar's guidebook. So we see a large, fancy house. There's a gloved hand holding up a magnifying glass, and the part that is magnified is on the house. The windows, you can see the detail of the home. It looks, quite ornate. In my childhood, I was surrounded by Victorian homes, so that's where my mind goes. And outside of the magnifying glass, what you actually see are human bodies falling from the big house towards the ground. But it's not in view of the magnifying glass. And in fact, the magnifying glass itself has a rose hue. The sky is black, and the clouds are almost reaching down towards this big house. So just by looking at this card, I think it's always helpful to discern what you see in the card before you go to any book or any other source. So I've already noticed that this magnifying glass has a rose hue. And we all know the saying, looking at life through rose-colored glasses. So we're seeing what we want to see. We're seeing things that are rosy. And what we're not seeing is, death and destruction, to be frank. And so when I go to the book, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll read a little bit for you. The book has a plant correlation, which is oak. It also has a Bible verse, but I'm just going to read a little bit about the image and the meaning here. A woman looking at a plantation home with rose-colored lenses is unable to see the suffering of the people plummeting from the window. It's like they don't even exist. There is no greater symbol of Southern gentility than a majestic plantation home surrounded by lush Victorian gardens. Every year, millions of people from all around the world flock to the South for plantation tours as their guides prattle on about lemonade, quaint customs, and corseted balls during what many people call a simpler time. What they don't tell you is that most of those villages and fields were already there and thriving prior to the arrival of foreigners. In other words, Indigenous people were literally forced to work on their own land. So this, quote, simpler time was certainly the reality for hundreds of prosperous slave owners. It was not for thousands of enslaved people and indentured servants. For them, the big house was far from beautiful and was instead an unpredictable house of horrors. When the big house comes up in a reading, it may be trying to prepare you for a sudden change and the subsequent trauma that will come from it. There will be no opportunity to adjust. You will simply have to deal with the things the best way you know how. Okay, so Harriet Tubman. We know that she was born in about 1822, give or take. She was born enslaved. Her grandmother was from Senegal. We know that she died in 1913, and her birth name was Araminta Ross. Apparently, they called her Minty. So she renamed herself Harriet. I believe Harriet was her mother's name. And again, listener, please forgive me as I meander through this. It must have been a year ago or so, a little bit more than a year. And I had been wondering, as someone who was highly intuitive, what is the purpose of intuition? It's a real question for me. While I might know who's going to call me before the phone rings, I get wonderful parking spots sometime. I have synchronicity in my life that is almost beyond belief. I always joke that when I start telling the synchronicities and the things that I've experienced, it would be the worst movie that you've ever seen. Because you would say, well, that would never happen in real life. And that's what my life often is. It's a complex web of trauma and healing and beauty and decay. And so while I have these, delightful experiences, I learn so much from spirit, what I call spirit. So you can call it the creator, universe, God, Allah, existence, the Big Bang, whatever you need to call it. For me and my body, what that feels like is all the same. So I tend to just use the word spirit to encompass all of what I'm experiencing, that which created me and everything around, including the stars, the salamanders. Don't let me get started on spirit, right? But the question that I had been asking was like, is there any purpose to this outside of like having cool stories to tell? And it had been weighing on me very heavily because I felt like I was living a superficial life, not in the mainstream way. Let me be clear. And actually, there was someone who I was speaking to about my podcast, and the person said to me, oh, well, yes, food and death are very trendy right now. And I thought, well, wow, this person doesn't know me. And they don't know me at all. That was our first time speaking, likely our last. I am one of the least hip and trendy people I know. So sometimes I pick up on things that become trends. So maybe that's what's happening. But my interest and dedication to divination, specifically with stones, listening to the trees, learning from the plant and animal and insect and avian life all around me. What is the purpose? Is there anything greater than just me healing my own trauma? I genuinely wanted to know. Now, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but I assume so, where a song comes on at a particular time and it hits different, like it sounds different. And in that moment that you're receiving some sort of message. It might be about a breakup. It might be about a death. It might be a beloved dead reaching through the veil to comfort us. But that's what happened to me one day. I was driving and I was tumbling this question in my mind. What is the purpose of intuition? And a song came on. So the song that came on was Whatcha Gonna Do by Jayo Felony, featuring Method Man and DMX. I can give it to you, but what you gonna do with it? I can give it to you, but what are you going to do with it? That message rang so deep. I started telling everyone, right? Oh my gosh, this song came to me. And that, for a while, was the answer to my question, right? That we can be given skills, we can be given gifts, but what are we going to do with it? Some of us out here, you may identify as a highly sensitive person or an empath. You might identify as a healer. And so you might say, well, I'm helping people. I'm tuning into my loved ones. I'm sensing what is needed for my neighbor. I'm allowing the right words to come to me to bring someone else comfort. All of those things are valid. But as time progressed, I still didn't have a direction. And it felt to me as if there was still something missing from that response. So more time passed, and I had pre-ordered Tricia Hersey's book, Rest as Resistance. If you don't know who Tricia Hersey is, well, let me let you know. Her platform on all the places, Instagram, Twitter, the website, is The Nap Ministry. And when you start following her work, you'll see that she's an advocate for rest and naps as resistance, as reparations. And in preparation for her book release, of course, she went on the podcast circuit, and I listened to all the episodes, just gobbling up all of what she was saying. And one of the things she kept talking about was Harriet Tubman. And Hersey would talk about Tubman in a way that made me fall in love, to be quite frank, with Harriet, Miss Tubman, Miss Harriet. Let me not be disrespectful. And she would say, well, she was a trickster, and she was subversive, and she knew her divinity, and she used her imagination. And I thought, well, my goodness, I thought I knew Harriet Tubman's story, but clearly I do not. One of the things that a lot of biographers want to make known is that Harriet Tubman could not read or write. This is something that comes up over and over again, that she could not read or write. And Hersey makes it a point to say she could not read or write language, English specifically, but she would read the stars. She could speak with something that was much greater than her. And this has largely been removed from so many of her biographies and articles about her. People tend to downplay the skills and gifts that Harriet Tubman had. Let me side note myself real quick. I keep saying skills and gifts. In different spiritual worlds, there's different language used. Some people say that it's a gift. Other people say this is not a gift from God. This is a skill that you can develop. Personally, I think both are true. Whatever rings true for you, at this point, I don't think the language is as important as what I'm about to say. So I started researching Miss Harriet Tubman and learning more about her. And again, because so much of her psychic phenomena is buried, I had to be very specific in what I was looking for. So there's a magazine, Science Edge, Current Research and Insights. This is issue number 50. I believe it was from June 2022. The title of this article is Harriet Tubman Precog by Eric Wargo. And then there's more about the Pentagon's UFO program in this particular issue as well. So a great deal of my information is gathered from that article, as well as several podcasts that I've listened to, as well as another book. So it is probably November 2022, and I am learning more and more about Harriet Tubman. I'm excited for the release of the Rest is Resistance book. And it was in, I believe, March of 2023 that another book comes out. The Spirit of Harriet Tubman, Awaking from the Underground by Spring Washam. Spring Washam is a meditation teacher. Harriet Tubman came to Washam in a series of visitations, quite literally visitations. And so this book is a channeling of Miss Tubman's spirit and her message. Harriet Tubman used her psychic abilities to get free and to free others. There are many books about her. I believe that more information is going to come out about her. There's a book, The Moses of Harriet Tubman, The Moses of Her People, was published while she was alive. And so a few of the things that we know about her childhood as an enslaved child is that she was forced to work very, very early on in life, 3 and 4 years old. A part of her job was to rock the baby of the slave masters. And she would fall asleep. And from what she has shared, this family who owned her and her relatives, her parents, her siblings, were incredibly violent and harsh. So even as a toddler, she was under great duress. At 9 years old, thereabouts, she was, I believe, in a general store. And another enslaved person, I believe he was an adult male, ran into the store or near the store trying to escape. So this man is running from his captor, or perhaps a slave catcher. And that person, the captor, throws a metal object, an iron or something like that, at the man who's trying to gain his freedom and have safety. And instead of hitting that gentleman, Harriet Tubman, 9 years old, was hit upside the head. It was a severe injury. She was bleeding all over the place. And I believe she had the afternoon off and was forced to go back to work the next day. Eventually, she was deemed, quote unquote, good for nothing. Her captors tried to sell her to a different family and were unsuccessful. She developed narcolepsy. Some people said that she was hysterical. And I believe that modern doctors have said, well, this is a temporal lobe. She had temporal lobe epilepsy. One of the dreams that Harriet had before she escaped to freedom was that she would be flying, and women in white would pull her across a river. There are accounts that she may have inherited these gifts from her father. So maybe it wasn't a traumatic brain injury, but in fact, it was inherited. But she would have dreams and extrasensory abilities. She has said that later, when she was escaping on the Underground Railroad, and when she was helping other people escape as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, she would actually see places and faces from that initial dream when the women in white were pulling her across the river. And so she would know certain people and who would help her. She would know which way to go because she had already dreamt it. You might call this remote viewing or astral projection, precognitive dreams. If I can just take an aside for one moment, there are many scientific developments that have come from precognitive dreams, including the theory of relativity by Einstein, quantum mechanics, and insulin as a remedy for diabetes. Some of the experiences that Tubman had on the Underground Railroad are specifically related to dreams and rest as resistance, and rest as a portal. If she came to a crossing in the road and didn't know which way to go, she would actually lay down and take a nap. There are accounts that her passengers would sometimes get upset at her because she would just have these sleeping spells where she would be caught up in a moment and unable to be communicated with. But then she would say, God told me which way to go. And time after time, they would later learn that she would take a left, but to the right, there were dogs and captors looking for her. She became very famous. Her name and her face would be on flyers, and she would shapeshift, actually. This is where Tricia Hersey would call her a trickster, someone who can exist in more than one realm and have more than one reality at one time. So one example of this is she was crossing a bridge once, and there were young Irishmen, laborers working. And at that time, the Irish were not considered white like the English settlers and colonists. So they had far less status and maybe therefore weren't as quite big of a threat. And so she's crossing this bridge. This was in Delaware. And Harriet Tubman started flirting with them. Let's take a moment to really think about this moment. Here she is, a dark-skinned Black woman who is a fugitive, crossing a bridge with two white males who are working and who could have easily been her captors. And she begins flirting and saying things like, I'm looking for a husband. Might one of you be my husband? And she made them laugh and distracted them. There's another story of when she was visiting her old plantation to gather her parents, or perhaps this is when she was getting her brothers, and her former captor was right there. And in order to go undetected, she caused a commotion with the chickens. I just love this because it's almost cartoon-like, right? That she used something so playful as chickens cuckling and fluttering about to protect herself. She would also pretend to be old and confused so that no one would think she were this sly, cunning spy, that she's just an old Black woman who's confused and doesn't know anything, and she would go undetected. She would also dress up as a man, right? So she was quite literally a shapeshifter, and she would cloak herself almost in invisibility. Never once did she get caught. Never once did she lose a single passenger on the Underground Railroad. There are differing accounts of how many trips she took and how many people she freed. That doesn't matter to me in this moment. We know what she did. Okay? Another story is about the people who were assisting her. Again, Harriet Tubman was very well known. Often people called her Moses. So often people did think she was a man. So that was another way that she could go undetected. She would go to an office, let's say a law office in the North, and she would walk in and say, I hear you have money for me. And, someone behind a desk would say, oh, well, is that right? And she would say, well, yes, I'm Harriet Tubman. And they would say, well, how much money do you think we have for you? And she would say, well, I heard that you have $6.13. And well, sure enough, they would have received a check from Europe the week before with $6.13 for Harriet Tubman. There was another time she went to a different office and said, I hear you have money for me. And they said, we don't know what you're talking about. We don't have any money. And Miss Tubman said, okay, well, I'm going to go outside and I'm going to take a nap because you do have money for me. So I'm going to give you some time to get it together. And she went outside on their porch and took a nap. And because she was well known in certain circles, the townspeople who saw her napping on this porch walked into the office and gave money and said, when Miss Tubman wakes up, please give this to her. So she also had synchronistic and magical moments that are difficult to be explained outside of spirit working. And if you don't believe in spirit, well, then you just say, well, these are coincidences. I just want to refer briefly to Carl Jung, who said that synchronicity is meaningful coincidence. A couple other things I want to say about that time period before I move to us is that a lot of her supporters were Quakers as well as spiritualists. And the reason why this is important for me and my understanding is because these are two religions or faith systems that value silence and that believe in spirit. Spiritualists specifically did not think it was weird that God would be talking to you. But at that time in puritanical culture, God was not supposed to speak with you. And in fact, you would be considered, well, crazy. So what does this have to do with you and me? As Tricia Hersey so eloquently explains, capitalism was born on plantations. Capitalism was born out of trying to see how far you could push Black bodies. Could you work 20 hours a day with no sleep? How little food could you work on? And so when someone like myself rails against capitalism, and I sound like a broken record to my friends and family, what I'm really speaking on is grind culture with its roots in slave labor, right? Harriet Tubman dreamed herself free, quite literally. She used her extraordinary senses, whether you want to call them skills or gifts, to free herself, to free her parents, to free her brothers. In fact, speaking about her brothers, she had a dream that her brothers needed to be she had a dream that she needed to go back for her brothers immediately, and she did. And when she got to her old plantation, there were posters, even just in the area, there were posters of her brothers' faces. They were to be sold into the Deep South on Christmas Day. Their family, the Tubman family, were in Maryland at the time. And so she knew she had to get her brothers, and she did. I also want to side note myself again real quick because she was married. She had married a free man, and he did not think she should try to escape. He did not believe her. And so just in this lane of sometimes you might feel nutso, but when you know that you are being told things and you have proof and evidence in your life that the things that you are being touched to speak on or do are real, and the people around you are looking at you like, okay, weirdo, just know that that should not stop you. Please know that, because if it didn't stop Harriet Tubman, honey, it shouldn't stop you, okay? So when Tricia Hersey tells us to rest as liberation, there's many layers to this. Rest as reparations, right? To reclaim rest and shut-eye that if you are a Black person, your enslaved ancestors did not have, and specifically Black American. I know many people in the diaspora did not have enslavement in their lineage. The other part of what Tricia Hersey is telling us is that our dreams are a portal. So you likely already know what I'm saying in your body and in your bones. You likely already know what I'm saying, but I need to be very clear here. Tricia Hersey, before she wrote her book, would host nap vigils all throughout Chicago and Atlanta, in DC. And one of the things that would happen is that people would wake up from 2-hour naps and people in the same room would have the same exact dream. I have a story for you. When I was in hypnotherapy school, so this is 7 or 8 years ago, we would do different hypnosis on each other. Our instructors would do hypnosis with us. And so we would have practicums in class alongside the learning that we were doing. If I had not experienced this, I would not believe it were real. But this has happened to me. Although we were not asleep, we were in hypnosis. In my experience, I climbed down the base of a tree into the underworld, into a step ladder, through the dirt, through the soil, through the roots. And I found myself with a panther. The panther had very feminine energy and guided me to her den. She spooned me like a baby, like a child. And carefully with her teeth, she actually pulled back my scalp and licked my brain. She removed cobwebs and dried blood. And when she was done, she licked my scalp. She put the skin back and licked it and healed it and closed it and told me to continue to visit her. And she would teach me things. And at the end of that session, I climbed back up the roots and the system of the tree, and I came back into our world. And for a very long time, I still do meditation with Panther, not as often. Other more than humans have come to work with me. But especially at that time, some of the things that Panther was teaching me was if you just, for example, stare at a tree for a really long time. And you know, like when you're staring at something for a really long time and your eyes kind of lose focus and everything gets slightly blurry, Panther just said, sit there and just watch. And what you'll be able to notice is the difference between a shaking leaf and a bird. You will be able to begin to notice really small things like a hummingbird or a bee, where another person can't see it at all because they're not taking the time to watch with intention, to listen. Owl actually teaches me to listen. So in hypnotherapy class, we come out of trance and we go around the room sharing our experiences. And I share my very profound experience with Panther licking my brain. And my classmate, now my friend and colleague, Irene, says, oh my gosh, I had the same meditation. And Irene shared her experience with Panther. And for many years, we thought that this was just a fun synchronicity that she and I had. That panther came to both of us. And I'm sure, I don't know if Irene ever wondered this, but I certainly did. Was I in her meditation or was she in mine? Or did this happen to both of us for a bigger reason? Well, friends, in Spring Washam's book, The Spirit of Harriet Tubman, Awaking from the Underground, Harriet Tubman actually tells her that when she was conducting on the Underground Railroad, she was in fact a panther. And she would frighten people because her energy was so fierce. But she had a job to do. So she was not concerned with their fear. She was concerned with freedom, with liberation. So let's come back to you and me, okay? I recently shared on Instagram a message that has been pressing upon me, which is skill up, show up, grow up. That's how it's coming to me. What it feels like to me is whatever you are interested in, you need to commit and grow your skill set, friends. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes I latch on to something and then a few years later it becomes popular or large in pop culture. But what I have noticed in the past 10 years is a very large growing interest in astrology, crystals, tarot decks, forest bathing. Even think about COVID, right? Everyone all of a sudden became a gardener. You know, everyone turned to bread making. All of a sudden, everyone is making sourdough. We innately know how to survive. Those skills have been lost. But guess what, y'all? When the shit hits the fan, that's what we turn to. That's what we turn to. We relinquish the more modern things and go back to ancestral wisdom. So, friends, if you, let's say, are into crystals, most people I know who are into crystals don't really work with them. They tend to like them. They might purchase them at a crystal shop because they say, oh, this is for protection. And you put crystals on your nightstand or on your fireplace mantle, and you don't really work with them outside of that. You know, you might use your runes when you're making a really big decision. You might like reading your astrology report for the week. What feels true for me as these extrasensory interests are growing in pop culture and in mainstream culture, I want to say something that might feel scary to you. I hope not at this point. But if you were ever in a position where your life is in danger or freedom was on the line, you might just be guided using your precognition, your dreams, your meditation, your prayers, the stars. I might have already said this, but Harriet Tubman was many, many things, including an astronomer and an herbalist. She studied the plants. And I don't mean studied with a textbook, because as all the biographies tell us, she could not read or write. But she knew how to feed people and keep them alive while traveling hundreds of miles from Maryland to sometimes Canada. She actually brought her parents to Canada and helped them cross the border into freedom in Canada. I believe she herself settled in Pennsylvania. But when I say skill up, show up, and grow up, this is a part of what I'm talking about. If you are someone who's experienced a great deal of trauma in their life and you have a nervous system that tends to freeze and you are immobilized by what you are experiencing, then my friend, take your nervous system healing seriously. Learn how to work with your nervous system so that you are not frozen if there ever comes a time that safety is on the line. That certainly happened to me in COVID, in those early days specifically. I know that we're still in COVID. I'm speaking specifically about the initial shutdown starting in March of 2020 and the fear that there's this unknown virus. We don't know what it'll do. You don't know if you have it. It won't manifest for 10 days, but you might die. Well, as someone who grew up with disabled and sick parents, I can tell you there's nothing more frightening than that for me. I stopped eating. I physically could not eat. I was completely frozen. And I really haven't spoken much about this outside of personal conversations because I was embarrassed. But I remember looking outside and watching my neighbors walking by. We're all keeping such distance from each other. We're wearing masks in public. And I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. And I ended up taking online classes for nervous system regulation. If you are someone who considers themselves a witch, if you are someone who wants to be an herbalist, get to it, my friends. As we saw during the COVID lockdown, we didn't have toilet paper. You might have to locate other ways of wiping oneself. And you will need to know the difference between mullein and poison oak. If you are interested in astronomy and astrology, if you find yourself stargazing or looking up at the clouds, well, my friends, one of the books that had a great impact on me in my recent years is The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. And you might find yourself, hopefully not, but you might find yourself in a position where you need to be guided to safety by using the stars, by knowing which way the sun rises and sets. I know this feels scary to even think about, but this is the truth. And this is what is wanting to come forth, but not just through me. So one of the things that Spring Washam talks about in her book, The Spirit of Harriet Tubman, is that Tubman is a Bodhisattva, someone who incarnates over and over again in a selfless way to help others. In my own studies, Mother Mary, Jesus' mother, also seems to be a Bodhisattva. One of the things that happens is that they make themselves visible in different parts of the world to different people. There have been sightings of Mother Mary in Medjugorje, as well as in Portugal. And while not all of those sightings are certified, I'm using air quotes with this, certified by the Catholic Church, make no doubt about it that people who feel visited by Mother Mary or Kuan Yin or any other deity know in their body that they have been visited. I'm actually going to side note myself just for a moment to read you a poem that I wrote a couple nights ago. While I have been writing poetry and short stories since I was in grade school, and I have my formal education in literature and creative writing, the poems that I've been writing recently are very much so being channeled. These poems have been pouring out of me. And I didn't think I needed to write about this thing that happened to me as a child because I wrote a poem in college about this. But I wrote it yesterday after learning new information, or a couple nights ago. This poem is called Coco Robinson. Oakland, 1985. I thought I had stigmata. Oh, I didn't tell you that part? Remember when I stepped on a nail when Uncle Ernest was building the shed in the backyard? He told me too. He said, "Watch out for the nails." But my head was in the clouds, and the nail went right through my foot, just like Jesus. I still got the scar. Then a few weeks later, a piece of metal from your Chevrolet stabbed my palm, and I bled on the back seat while you drove to church. And then a few weeks after that, well, you get the idea. I was patiently waiting for a lash to appear upon my chest, or even a crown of thorns made of roses from grandmother's garden. But it never came. I only had a whisper of Jesus's visit, not even an echo that someone else could hear, just me. But in Oakland, in 1972, Coco Robinson had it for real. and bled for weeks from her forehead and palms for everyone to see. Now, friends, I'm not saying that Jesus has visited me. What I'm saying is that when I'm laying in bed and I can't sleep because full sentences and phrases are coming to me, and I get on my computer and I type out a whole new poem, this is what came out of me. I learned about this young lady, Coco Robinson, maybe a couple years ago. This is a true story, that a little Black girl in the town I'm from and was living in had stigmata probably 13 or 14 years before I thought I had stigmata. Because I was raised Catholic and we hear about stigmata and angels, and many of the saints were martyrs who would have visions. Yes, my imagination was wild and grand. But Tricia Hersey reminded me that Harriet Tubman used her imagination. This is how she understood the world. So she's back, friends. She's back. I am strongly encouraging you to devote yourself to that which is calling you. If you are an artist, do art. If you are a writer, be obedient. Be obedient to what is calling you. Julia Mallory said this in episode 11, to be obedient to your creativity. And I strongly encourage you in your study and devotion to allow yourself to remove the rose-colored glasses that are shielding you from what is happening at the big house. See what is happening, even if it is uncomfortable, even if it is scary. We are being called upon today to bear witness to the long-term effects of colonization, imperialism. We are destroying our planet and each other. Pay attention. Your intuition and your divination skills are important. They are important beyond getting great parking spots. It is about skilling up so that you can show up. This might come in the form as prayer or meditation. I love this saying I've heard in the spiritual community, that prayer is talking to God and meditation is listening. If you're not religious and the word prayer makes you uncomfortable, that's fine. Use a different word. Song. I'm talking to the universe. I'm talking to the trees. I'm talking to the stars. I'm talking to the sun. Speak to that which is greater than you. And build in time to listen, to hear, to see, to know. Practice your skill. If you consider it a gift, say thank you and practice it. Back when I was a kid, the saying was practice makes perfect, but we know that shit is trash. Practice makes skilled. So if you are into divination, then use your cards daily. Whatever it is that you're using, do it daily. Ask the spirits around you who are well and secure if they are willing to help you. And become in relationship with those spirits, with your well ancestors, with the ancestors of land, with the ancestors who are here today as young children. The self-care industry is most certainly a cog on the capitalism wheel, right? We see self-care as going to get a mani-pedi, me time is going shopping or something like that. And I'm going to challenge you to grow out of these very superficial and capitalistic ways of thinking. Your self-care is to refill your cup. Everything you do takes energy. Me recording this podcast takes energy. Me editing this, me posting on Instagram, me going to work, me communicating with my loved ones. Tomorrow morning, I'm making pancakes for some relatives coming over. All of that is work, right? All of this takes energy and time. And so we refill our cups, not so that we can do more, but because we are divine beings. So refill your cup in a sincere way. I deeply encourage all of us to become sincere and obedient and have depth when we talk about our self-care. What refills your cup? Getting your nails done might make you feel good, and that's valid. Joy. What else? What in nature refills your cup? The wind? The rain? The ocean? A lake? Burning a fire? Grasping onto metal? How does that which is greater than you nourish you? And how can you deepen that relationship? I'm going to share another personal anecdote that I had not planned on sharing. But we also often hear how much physical exercise is important, right? It's a part of your self-care. It's your mental health. Well, our ancestors didn't need to go to the gym. Their daily lives were incredibly physical. And I have learned in my own experience that there's something divine about this. Let me share more. I used to be a runner. I've run several 5Ks, 10Ks, half marathons. I've done one full marathon, but I did a few ultras, meaning more than 26.2 miles. And when I was training for some of these races was during the time I was in hypnotherapy school. This is also when my inner child work began to come forth. I'd get up early and I'd go run. I'd watch the sunrise as I was running. And one of the things that would happen is that I would be tending to my inner child, a small version of myself, me at say 6 years old as I was running. And guess who else showed up? Panther. So I would be running and I would imagine 6-year-old me riding the panther alongside. One of my early meditation practices included the practice of Tonglen, which is on the inhale breath, breathing in the suffering around you. Specifically at that time, for me, it was my parents. And me working through survivor's guilt as someone with an able body when my parents were disabled. And so I'm breathing in the pain that I'm witnessing of my parents not being able to care for themselves or me. And then I would exhale what I wanted for them, which is freedom. To have a healed body, to have a free body. One thing that came up for me probably about 7 years ago was there had been the murder of a Black man by police officers. There was a protest in Oakland, and I could feel a burning inside of my chest. And Oakland is where I was living at the time. So when I got off from work that day, I got on my knees to pray. And I could not stay in that place. And I got up and just listening to my body. This is before I knew what somatics was. I don't even think I knew the word somatic at that point. But I got up and I started dancing in my bedroom by myself. So recently, if you've been listening to the podcast or if you've listened to earlier episodes, then you know that my body has gone through a lot of different things over the past 4 years. One of those things included plantar fasciitis. Now that my body seems to be on the other side of that pain, that pulling of my tendons and my feet, making it painful to walk. I wanted to get back in my body and become active again, but I needed fun. So I decided to start taking dance classes. And so I go once a week to an Afrobeats class. And it is the highlight of my week. I'm sharing this because a long ago ancestor came to me 2 days ago through a different series of synchronistic events that I will not get into here either. But he came to me. One of the things that he said, how I can better hear him is to dance more. And he said, the more that my feet hit the ground, the better I will be able to hear. Because this just happened 2 days ago, I can't wrap this up with a neat bow and tell you how this ancestor brought me this amazing information that has changed my life. But what I can do is tell you that I trust what he is saying to be true. That the synchronicity I've experienced in my life thus far is evidence enough for me to tend my intuition with great care, sincerity, and obedience. Skill up, my friends. The time is now. Thank you for listening to Recipes for Grief. You can find more information about today's guest on the podcast page of your player, as well as their recipe card that's available on my website, AndreaSextonDumas.com. That's AndreaSexton, D as in donut, UMAS.com. If you'd like to share your recipe for grief, leave a 3-minute voicemail at the following number, and your message may be played on a future episode as a listener shout out. That number is 510-426-6041. That's 510-426-6041. Find me on Instagram and TikTok at Recipes for Grief. And now, here's a little advice from my grandmother.
Life isn't easy. You just have to make the best of it.